Thanks, Robin. You know what I love about things like the way the songs worked and what Robin shared is Catherine had said, whilst she prayed about it, she did, and she felt over the songs, she wasn't looking at themes, she was just doing the songs that she felt God say. And she also didn't talk to Robin, who had no idea what the songs were. And here we are with a theme that ran all the way through. How often God likes to do that. Delight in when we trust Him, how things come together and work out. Yet again this week, I'm going to do this from a stool. May sound weird, but it's been a very intentional choice because I think there's something about when talking about Sabbath, maybe representing a little rest. The idea that we can just breathe out. So why don't you just take a moment, close your eyes, take a big deep breath in, and a big deep breath out. Do that a few times. Lord, absolutely we have the Sabbath day, but we have a Sabbath moments. Right now in this place, would this be a Sabbath moment? One of rest, one of worship, one of encountering you. Amen. So, for those who were here last week, you know that we had really, the core of where we started last week was around a whole lot of questions. There are all sorts of questions, actually, so I will use that slide, the really full slide towards the end that's purple and orange, hun, with lots of questions on it. All manner of questions that people can have, that you might have. I might have missed some that you have. And we talked just a broad overview about that we're going to move into this series for this week, for this month. We went into our groups and had a discussion. We also talked about there being a choose your own adventure element. So look, I don't know what you covered in your groups. I only know what covered in mine, all the things that came out of that, yeah? But we talked about that for this time, some places call it activation, others call it homework. I'm no longer a teacher, I don't like those words. And I like the choose your own adventure because it's like the books you used to read that I mentioned to the people last week. You know, those books where you get to a certain point and you could decide, did you want this to happen or that to happen? I loved that I got to be a part of the story. We're on the same journey. And so we had a couple of different options for people who were here last week. It's also on YouTube and sent out in an email. But I wondered how you went. You don't have to tell me details, but did people have a go at their activation? See, I've been in a course yesterday where they used the word activation. Do you know how prone we are to influence? To your own adventure. Did people have a go at something Sabbath-based this week? I know we've had a post. We had a post from Frank and Robin. We had one from Anna. It's an invitation. I know Pete and he got home and we talked and he decided, if I'm able, yep. We've talked about this on and off. Sundays are a component of Sabbath for us, and it's a bit of a half-half. You'll find out how and why that's shared into the sermon. But he said, I think it needs to start for him. Here's just from Saturday night. So from Saturday night, it's Sabbath through to Sunday night, and he won't do any work in that time. It's then if there needs to be anything done, anything to prepare for the week on Monday, he'll do it Sunday night after dinner. That was what came out of his time. And so that's his activation he started last week. And you'll hear this week a bit later how he's now put that into play for something this week to make it work in light of what our weekend was this weekend. I don't know what yours will be, but we talked about it. It can be delights. Actually, our options for last week that you can still do whenever you choose to do. They're just invitations. But we're to make a life-giving list. What are the things that you love doing that bring something deep and joyful? Now, some of those happen often outside of Sabbath, whenever your Sabbath is. I mentioned that one of mine is that there's just something that I just relax into when Pete just leans his hand over as we're going to sleep. Just a point of connection. It's like all my Christmases at once, which might fit today because Catherine thinks I look Christmassy today. And Barry thinks I'm wearing beautiful red slippers. So maybe that's what it is. It's the red boots that made me look like I might fit for Santa or something. That happens more than just a Sabbath. But if we have a list, then we know what we can pull from when we're looking to do something that brings us delight on a given day, on a Sabbath. And then the other one was that there was 12 listed things that often happen on Sabbaths, that biblically and through Jewish tradition are things they do to celebrate, from lighting a couple of candles to having a meal to, and there are 12. I won't say them all out loud right now. And the suggestion to choose 3, or to just even dream what your perfect Sabbath day would be in connecting with God and having fun. So those were last week's. Now we get into this week, looking at this, starting to explore some of what Scripture says and seeking to answer some of those questions. So I want to say in all of this, as an overview, this is an invitation, not a requirement. We are going to talk, and I'm going to say, I believe it's something that God has for us. I think it's vital for life. There are 2 sides. There are those scholars and pastors who believe it no longer is something that is commanded of us. It's something that's given for life for us. Like, we now live in a Sabbath-free life, like Sabbath world. Jesus is our Sabbath, and so it's all the time. But I only have to look at most people, especially Christians, to wonder if they're living in Sabbath for me to question that thought, yeah? But I'm going to explain why I think it actually still exists, even though it's, because we often go back to the commandments and say, well, it was in those commandments for that covenant, but that covenant is not the covenant we live under anymore. Well, I could go into how Jesus said that he came to fulfill the law and not abolish anything of it. So yes, there's a shift, and he is that. And I could then talk about how he still celebrated it, and he reminded us that whilst Sabbath is, man is not for the Sabbath, Sabbath is for the man. So we're not required to be bound to it. It's a life-giving thing. But actually today I want to talk about that it didn't start at the commandments. It didn't start at the covenant. It started at creation. There are 2 occasions that occur before we even get to the 10 Commandments. And actually first mentions, I've probably said to you before, there's one hermeneutical approach that says, or a study of Scripture approach, that says first mentions are vital because they give us the clue to context. So let's have a look at the first mention. And if you're up for getting up the first image for a reference for them, I thought it was a kind of cute version, and look up Genesis chapter 2. And you have access to our Bible, Peter? Online one? That's okay if we don't get to that because I didn't think to remind you about that earlier. But Genesis chapter 2 in the NKV version, don't know why I wrote J, the New King, there you go, New King James Version. I'm reading from that today. And I might also read from the Message version, but have a look with yours. So we've hit the end of creation, and at the start of Genesis 2 it says, "Thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. And on the 7th day God ended his work which he had done. And he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it." Some versions would say called it holy, "because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made." The Message version says, "Heaven and earth were finished down to the last detail. By the 7th day God had finished his work. On the 7th day he rested from all his work. God blessed the 7th day. He made it a holy day, because on that day he rested from his work, all the creating God had done." This is the story of how it all started, of heaven and earth when they were created. Thus completes creation. The first mention of Sabbath is all the way back at the beginning of creation, when it is complete. And I think just pay attention to a few things in the language that I'm going to unravel. So if I go back to that, The NKV version, also in the ESV version, if you're interested in another one, they say sort of, it's a bit of a confusing way this is written in the original Greek, yeah? In the original Hebrew, sorry, because we're in the Old Testament. In the original Hebrew, so they translate it in a way that kind of leaves a bit of ambiguity. Because it says, and on the seventh day God ended his work. But did he create anything more on the seventh day? Wasn't it finished on the sixth day? There's ambiguity in the way it's written in the original Hebrew. We'll come back to that thought. And then give reference to what Sabbath is called. They're two things that I wouldn't mind exploring. But I think the first one is to consider that we tend to view rest as recovery. We tend to think of it as a need to restore something. And often that's true. That's exactly where we've ended up, yeah? But can I ask you, did God need to recover? If we go to the first cartoon slide, Peter. Do we really think God went, oh, I'm done? God does not tire or get weary. So is there something more at work if God chooses to rest? And the word is rest. The word rest is actually Shabbath. We can get where Sabbath comes from, yes? Shabbath. So what was God doing instead when he did Shabbath? Well, I think he was enjoying all he'd created. For our next slide. Remember to click. It's obviously been a while since I've done that. He set a rhythm from the very beginning of time. A rhythm that said, we work and rest. So I want to be clear, we're talking a lot about Sabbath rest in the coming weeks. But Sabbath rest doesn't exist on its own. It exists with work. There's a flow God has for a fulfilling life, a rhythm that works to, I work and I rest. I work and I enjoy. I work and I am at peace. Actually, I'm peaceful even in my work. We've talked before about, I think what's gone wrong with work is sin has turned it into toil. That's the curse. But we are all called, and probably in heaven we'll also have things to do because that was what we were made for before the world had sin. So it might just be that for some of us, our contemplation is not, how do I Sabbath well, but am I actually working well? According to what God calls you, yeah? I think that when you hit retirement age, it's not that we stop contributing, it's that we stop having a paid job. We change a rhythm and a pace. But God says, you're not done. Tony shows us, you're not done. He comes and he joins in, that's part of his Sabbath expression too, but plays music. There are things we still can do and contribute because actually retirement isn't a God concept, thank you, isn't a God concept. There is a change of rhythm because there's a change of season of life. But so with that as a foundation, I want to suggest that firstly, Sabbath is rhythm. Sabbath is rhythm. Like night and day. It's hardwired into the fabric of our world. We can try to pull out night and day. We can try to ignore the need for sleep at night and the need for move. And shift workers will tell you it's hard, but they do so out of necessity. And we've introduced electricity as a means of doing so. And what's one of the things that's the consequence of electricity? We're up later than we should be, so we're less awake in the mornings, or we're not rested enough for what we need to do, or we're making our bodies sick. I have recently been diagnosed with sleep apnea. Because it was a family thing, I thought, let's stop burying my head in the sand and actually get it checked out. You know why? Because if I have it and my sleep is being affected, my breathing in the sleep, so there's a combination. It's not enough sleep, but it's also not enough air. I am damaging my heart. I am damaging my organs. I am actually increasing my risk of diabetes and of weight. Now, that's not obviously the only reason that I have weight on my body. All those things are at risk, and I'm going to die earlier, statistically, if I don't deal with the sleep apnea. We know that at that end, but what about at the end of just the rhythm of ensuring we have enough rest? You can say all you like, but I don't need to now. The world is open 24/7. I can have what I want. I can do what I want. And we all know that if you choose to ignore that permanently and have none, it won't even just be a few years off your life. You'll be gone really soon. We cannot live without it. We can decide all we like that we're not under that war anymore, under that rhythm, anymore, and we'll still have the effects of it. And I think it's the same with Sabbath. We can say all we like, but we don't need to live under that particular thing anymore. But what are we dealing with? Because we are working against a created rhythm. And that word rested, that Shabbat word, means to repose, to desist, to cease. It even included in my Strong's Concordance definition to celebrate. Now, in no part of Scripture does it say celebrate, like is it translated celebrate? And yet I've read in elsewhere where they talk about there is a heart at it that has celebration. In the word, that's what they understood. In the Exodus retelling of this, in the command, which I don't have with me, terrible, I've got my phone. There was a reason I grabbed my phone. Let me read you that command because it links straight back to the communion, the creation. I'm having fun with my C words today, aren't I? It relates all the way back and links to, I just went to Genesis 2 because that's what I was going to say, instead of going to, my thing goes, I must be in the wrong type of Bible because my thing goes from Genesis to Joshua. Okay, thank you. I was a little confused. What happened to my books? They've obviously added new books. Okay, Exodus, there we go, that's where I went. Exodus 20 says, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigners residing in your town. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The first time the Israelites are given the command to Sabbath, creation is referenced. God and creation is referenced. I'll tell you if you haven't ever noticed before, but you can go have a look, that when it's mentioned in Deuteronomy, the reason is a different reason. The description is the same. Rest, and not just you, but everyone in your family and everyone connected to you and anyone who works for you. That's the same, but the reason is different. Here, the reason is to remember that God created. And the word there that's used for rested is not Shabbat. That word is nuach. It also means rested. And I wanted to reference that because I've got this book by not a Christian, a Jewish man. It's a seminal book for Sabbath, Sabbath reflections that a lot of people reference. Obviously, people of a Jewish background have a real heart to understand Sabbath. They're still living in a first covenant version of it. And he talks about it, but he references a variation on that word nuach. He references manure, which has the same root element to it. And he starts with this thought, after the 6 days of creation, what did the universe still lack? Remember I said that the ESV and the NKJV kept that awkward, that unclear, that was what I was looking at, unclear version of how it was said. On the seventh day, God ended his work, as though there was something still not done. Is there something still not done? After 6 days of creation, what did the universe still lack? Manure, rest. Came a Sabbath, came manure, and the universe was complete. Manure, which is usually rendered with rest, means here much more than withdrawal from labor and exertion, more than freedom from toil, strain, or activity of any kind. Manure is not an aggressive concept, but something real and intrinsically positive. This must have been the view of the ancient rabbis if they believed that it took a special act of creation to bring it into being, that the universe would be incomplete without it. What was created on the seventh day? Tranquility, serenity, peace, and repose. To the biblical mind, manure is the same as happiness. Rest is the same as happiness and stillness and peace and harmony. The word with which Job described the state after life he was longing for is derived from the same root. It's heaven with God. It's a state wherein man lies still, wherein the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest. It is a state in which there is no strife and no fighting, no fear and no distrust. The essence of good life is manure. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters, the waters of Manuhot. In later times, manure became a synonym for the life in the world to come. Ancient rabbi understanding suggested God hadn't finished creation on the sixth day. Just a thought to contemplate. I'm not that level of a theologian, and the language is ambiguous. But could it be that God still did create something? He created rest. We are called to cease one day a week to have happiness, stillness, and a lack of strife. And yet you and I know realistically, in this world, that day will not be guaranteed to be without strife. Often in our souls to start with. Because you might just find, well, I'm done with trying to do Sabbath because whenever I stop, all I get is churning up. Might that be an invitation for God to do that healing, like he did literal healings on the Sabbath when he was on earth? Healing in us, bring up what needs to be sorted through to allow us to find that place of peace and tranquility. That might be the invitation. We're to have happiness, and we'll talk in later weeks about how Sabbath is meant to be a delight. But today to focus on Sabbath is a stop and a rest. That's part of the rhythm of life, and why we say Sabbath as rhythm. What are we to stop from? It's a question we all want to know. What am I or aren't I allowed to do? And reminding you that it's not allowed or not to, it's invitation to or not to, yeah? But in a broad concept, it is to cease from our usual work. Let me read. I love this book. Ruth Haley Barton does some wonderful stuff on all sorts of practices and spiritual approaches in a really down-to-earth way. And this was what I read when I was on my sabbatical, a book called Embracing Rhythms of Work and Rest, From Sabbath to Sabbatical and Back Again. But in 21, she says, one of the reasons I find, there you go, that she's quoting someone else, if I remember to read from the right section, a guy called Pastor David Alvers, who says, the Hebrew word Shabbat, used by God in Genesis, is really a stopping or ceasing more than a rest. God never tires. He did not rest on the seventh day. He is the one who never sleeps nor slumbers. He needs no rest. Bible translators would have been better served to stay close to the denotive definition of the Hebrew than to have made it seem like God just took a short breather. He ceased from his work. He stopped what he was doing. That is what he meant to communicate. Therefore, what is called of us to do on our Sabbath? To make an abrupt end to our labour. All labour? No. Our usual labour. The labour we've been doing the other 6 of the 7-day week. Ruth Bailey Barton says one of the reasons that she finds the nuance of this life giving is that there can be some activities that are considered work that bring such delight to me that I actually save them for a Sabbath so that I can savor them rather than just push them off my to-do list. For her, that's gardening. For you, that could well be work. You need to put it in your 6 days because it is not life-giving. For another, cooking is just something you have to do, and it's a slog. But we all know for Catherine, that's a delight. Who thinks that Catherine should absolutely do cooking on a Sunday if that brings her delight? And that we're probably okay with tasting some of it. And Harold, if he wants to live, is going to nod right now rather than shaking that head I just saw. He's already lived dangerously today. We stop from our usual work. And in part, rather than dashing around, making sure that we've gotten all the jobs done we need to do, because at the moment we often work 5, maybe 6 days in our usual job. But the other parts of our usual job are the lawns and the mowing and the bills to pay, lawns and mowing anyway, the bills to pay and the cleaning to get done. And we jam all of it in. You're never going to have it finished to be able to go, I'll do it when I'm finished. It needs to be a choice we make where we're at. And so in answer to when we do it, often people talk about, is it Saturday, is it Sunday? In this telling in Genesis, it is the Saturday. It doesn't say that outright. It became the pattern. Friday night, Jewish people would start their Sabbath. They would have a Sabbath meal. Light 2 candles, have a Sabbath meal of tradition. There's a number of rituals in that special meal. And they do so till Saturday night. Actually, it's about 20 minutes before sunset. So at the moment, it starts earlier. Still 24-hour period. In the summer, could you imagine here, in the summer? Way later. It became, for Christians moving into Protestant times, even Catholic times, it became Sunday because we celebrated together and worshipped together on a Sunday in honor of where we believe Jesus rose. And so it became a part of that day. And how many people lived in a tradition or grew up in a tradition where it wasn't just that you went to church and that was Sabbath worship, but that you actually then did nothing for the rest of the day? We didn't even go to the shops when I was little, early on. Yeah, but there was a bakery open and things like that. Yes, you could still go put petrol in your car and grab something from the petrol station. And that didn't happen. And in time, it became just the Sunday service. We've celebrated, we've Sabbathed, we've had our day of rest by going to church. And then we go home and just do all the things we would usually do. When should it be for you? Well, I guess as we're journeying along, you'll work out where that might best fit. I would suggest that Sunday probably works for most of you, most of us. Yeah? Because worship and Sunday service and even serving in it is a part of Sabbath. Sabbath is done in community. Sabbath is spending time with God in community. And sometimes, not all the time, we do that to help others at the same time. And then for the rest of the day, how you might choose to have that. And to the point that as a team we have talked about, there will not be meetings put on Sundays to the best of our ability. There might be gatherings because that's community. Have you over for a meal. Have a set group over for a meal. But meet to talk about something. Meet to do some leadership work. Well, we don't want to add weight and toil and work to our Sabbath, to your chance to have what is probably the easiest day you can do to have a Sabbath. Because you'll work. Most of you will have work Monday to Friday. And Saturday will be full of home tasks. But maybe that isn't. It's your choice where it falls. For me, Sabbath is not, for Pete, it's, as we said, from sundown Saturday to sundown Sunday, roughly, yeah? For me, that doesn't work because this is my usual work. It is also my worship, but it's my usual work. But so we have a component of Sabbath together. I start mine from lunch on Sunday. That way we have all of Sunday afternoon together. And if he doesn't have anything extra to pick up Sunday night for work, we have Sunday night together. And then I have half of Monday. And by about lunchtime or 2 o'clock on a Monday, it's like, okay, now I can come at some things that I might need for the coming week. That's a new rhythm as I've changed my work hours at school to allow that to happen. Because I also want to be a part of a community that Sabbaths together. So what might it be for you? What does it mean for you to stop? To put aside all of the bad consequences that you think will happen if you don't get something done? What would it look like for you to take a day to cease your usual work activities and enjoy some happiness, peace, and tranquility? To enjoy, or might I use another word, to play. It's not Mary, it's Marva Dawn in Keeping Sabbath Holy says, the key to experiencing the Sabbath in the richness of its design is to recognize the importance of its rhythm. In what way might you play and enjoy the rhythm of a day off? Now that fits the rest side, and that covers this idea that maybe that was what was created on the seventh day. But I mentioned there was another thing to take note of. I think it's interesting what the very first thing that was called holy. The very first thing in the Bible to be called holy was not a person, was not a group of people, was not a place. It was a time. It was a day that God called holy. Now, I don't know how you hear that word holy. I think sometimes we're inclined to think it means it's of something perfect and, I don't know, the heavenly sounds going and the angels and, wow, perfection in our being. But its meaning is simply set apart for God. Doesn't talk about being excellent. Doesn't talk about being without fault. It talks about being set apart for God. So it's wonderful that we can play, but if we're not careful, we might miss a component that's vital in a Sabbath day. It is for God. And it's our first reference for being for God. Sabbath is not just a rhythm, Sabbath is worship. Sabbath is a biblical tool for protecting time against desecration. It is the rhythmic setting apart of one day each week for praying and playing. The two activities for which we don't get paid, but which are necessary for a blessed life. A blessed life is what is biblically promised, and a blessed life is not mere survival, but a bountiful life. Praying and playing, a whoop and woof in the bounty. Who would like a bountiful life of play and pray? Keeping a Sabbath is simple and easy. We pray and we play. Two things we are pretty good at as children and can always pick up one again with a little encouragement. And if we can only find the time. But we don't have to find the time. It is given to us. A day a week, a Sabbath, a day to play and pray. God's gift. So says Eugene Peterson. He writes so beautifully, doesn't he? Just such rich language. We alluded to play before, but we need to also pray or worship. To consider how we notice God. We orient ourselves towards God. So that even as we're cooking, there's a joy that comes from, wow, how wonderful that there are these ingredients and you've created us to know how to put them together and play around with it. To being out for a walk and just finding your heart leap with, God, thank you for this beauty. Look what you've created. To with your plants or doing some creative artwork and thinking, my goodness, look at the colors available to us. Who knew there could be so much beauty available? God, you are amazing. So Sabbath as worship. The focus here is on the rhythm of it, because we worship God with our work also. We did a whole series on that last year. But now what can happen is that sometimes we do one without the other. When I had people raise their hands before for their encounter, that was our legalistic form of Sabbath that we encountered that said nothing is okay to do. It's what the Jews ended up doing. And Jesus criticized them for, essentially, by saying Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, because it was you can't do this and you can't do that. John Mark Comer said something interesting in one of his sermons on Sabbath around, have you ever noticed how often Jewish people live in a close together? And often they've managed for thousands of years not to have their culture slowly, even without a land, because they live close together. Why do they live close together? Because they're only allowed to travel so far on foot on the Sabbath day. So you live near your synagogue, or you don't worship on a Sunday. Because there are all these rules about what you are and aren't allowed to do, and you are and aren't allowed to cook, and you are and aren't allowed to participate in. And it came into our Protestant expression of Sabbath for a long time. Stay in your nice clothes, sit politely, be as kids. Don't go running around, don't go playing crazy, don't go watching TV, because it became only about the prey. The Puritan approach of we keep ourselves pure on that day from anything that might possibly smack or look like it was evil. Fun. But the word they would have said was evil. No playing cards. In the Dutch Reformed Church, obviously another church, no playing cards. I would say that my very devout, faithful Smith family, that's one of the ones I had no problem breaking way back when my dad was young as a son. They would play that regularly. But there were lots of other, can't go dancing, all sorts of things. But I think what happens at the other side, that's a legalistic side, but what can happen is that if we're not careful, we also then end up on the side of play only. That it's just a day off to enjoy to my pleasure whatever I'd like, without any thought to God or to worship or to prayer. That it doesn't have us even remembering to orient ourselves to God. So we come to church, on the weeks we come to church and worship there, and we go home and just enjoy our day as it happens. And it's not work enjoy, it's play enjoy. Can I tell you what Eugene Peterson calls that? It's a bastard Sabbath. One of the few times I use that word, but I think sometimes a graphic term is a real good description on we've taken something and turned it into what God didn't want also. Both versions are a problem. The Genesis account gives us a lovely invitation of joining God in ceasing and enjoying what is now complete. And you might go, but not everything is complete. Sure, in God's case, it was all complete. In our case, not all of it is. We enjoy what is complete. And we enjoy what is given to us from Him. We set apart the time as holy. You know what I think is lovely about this? I was thinking about as we were praying this morning, because there was just the most beautiful presence of God. We started with a song that Robin felt to do, which we don't often when the 2 or 3 of us gather to pray before the service. And we just were soaking in that for a while, and it came to my mind, how wonderful is it that God chose a holy thing to be a time and not a place? I know that we'll often choose to go to visit certain places because of what they hold for us, or they hold and we can sense. I have been to temples that are for other religions, sometimes with no effect, other times with I'm not actually going in there. There's an all-white type temple in Thailand, beautiful piece of artwork, and I couldn't walk in. I wouldn't walk in. And I'd been to others on that trip. And there's something. I get that there can be things on places, but God knew how often we would make the place the focus. And so when he set holy, he started by setting it as time. Because actually, anywhere you are, if you take the time, you have a Sabbath moment with God. That doesn't mean we don't come together. We come together not because this place holds anything, but because together, because faith is always in community, we encounter God in time. I love this wonderful real life story. There's a story that's told of wagon trains. You know, we watch all those Wild West movies and the wagon trains that would head out west. All the families in those lovely lovely. Probably if I was living in them, they wouldn't be so lovely. It's easy to romanticize when you're watching the movie. But living in those wagons and pulling everything out each night to stop. And a whole wagon train had set out for the west and they realised that they weren't going to make it before winter set in, and they were quite concerned about that. And so they had this discussion on how were they going to ensure that they get there in time. So what they discussed was, is it time to actually not stop on the Sunday, the Sabbath day? To actually just keep going, because if we don't, we'll run into trouble. And it split the camp or the group in two. There was a group who said, no, the Sabbath is a Sabbath and we need to stop and take that day of rest after all the work of travel that we've done each day. And the other group said, no, we're too anxious that we won't get there in time. We need to use every day that we have at our disposal. And so they split the two trains. One wagon train became two wagon trains. One train went every day from that point forward. The other train continued to stop on a Sabbath day. Guess who got there first? The one who stopped. And that defies our time logic. But there is something God has and something he's wired into our creation. We are more creative and more energetic and more able to process and more able to handle when we take a day of rest. Our facilities, our resources, and ourselves work better when there's a day of rest. I actually don't know the details on why the other group didn't get there. Was it because animals died because they couldn't keep up the pace? Was it because wagons broke and they had to stop for repairs? I have no idea what the reason is. But the one decision that was changed was one group stopped for Sabbath and one didn't. But the one that did got there. I think that leaves us with a wonderful invitation to remind ourselves to think through what might be our expression of Sabbath, that we would Sabbath as a rhythm and Sabbath as worship, the play and the pray. And I want to suggest 2 choose your own adventures. If you have a choose your own adventure slides, they're heading first. So for this week, as you're thinking about what it might be that you do, I want to reference back to a sermon that Anna did a couple of weeks ago on thresholds. She was talking about how, as she's heading out to the field, that she changes her shoes. There are moments when you take a transition. There's a threshold as you head, like when you carry the bride over the threshold into something. Yeah. And in her case, she puts on her gumboots, and at the same time thinks through and prays through what will happen out in the field, and out she goes. Well, thresholds are what happen in the moment when we transition into Sabbath. How might we mark as a ritual the beginning of a Sabbath moment? Sabbath. And I would suggest, you're not ready for a whole day? Hey, I'm all for, and I want to try and commit. I don't succeed every time I do Sabbath, to be honest. It's hard work. It sounds wrong because it shouldn't be work, should it? No. But because it's countercultural. We swim in a sea that says time is money. Keep going, keep going, keep going. But it isn't. Time is worship, and time is God, and time is a gift. Yeah? But having a moment that marks, this is the moment I move into, this Sabbath moment or this Sabbath day. So here are a number of suggestions for you. If we go to the next slide. I mentioned that the Jewish people, to start their Sabbath, will light 2 candles, and they'll light one for remembrance and one for observance. They'll say, let's remember and observe. It actually links to the commandments. Each of those, one says remember, one says observe. They'll then have a meal. You might share a meal, and yours might not have to have ritual. It just might be, let's sit and have a meal. Maybe in the process, we'll actually have a Thanksgiving moment where we'll share something wonderful we've encountered from God this week, or that we want to thank God for this week. Play. What might it be to sit down and go, if you've, particularly young kids, what if you started your Sabbath with a game? Here we are, kids. We're beginning our Sabbath time together. We're going to play. You might have a special blessing, whatever that is, blessing or prayer. There's something about the pattern of it. Think about the keys we do for sleep. I don't know what your routine is, but my routine is to walk into the ensuite, go to the toilet, brush my teeth, go to bed. In fact, it throws me a little if sometimes I have to do my teeth before I get to go to the toilet. But either way, those actions, coupled with getting into bed and having Pete in the bed next to in the bed next to me, not thank you, that's next to me in the bed. And we turn to each other and we say a few different things and we touch base before we go to sleep. To the point that after 3.5 years, consider I had no one in the bed with me for a long, all the time apart from him, that when he is away for work, without that final step in the routine, it takes me longer to get to sleep. Because there's a routine or ritual sets us up. What an opportunity and an invitation to pick a ritual, to pick a threshold moment that might set us up for our body to even look forward to Sabbath beginning. For in time it to become just that. In fact, I find that I can do more work and be more focused now that I've got this routine again. I had it a couple of years ago and lost it for a while. I can I can do the rest of this day. I can do all day this day. I can add that thing. I can, thrilled to have our grandkids with us this weekend, but it shortened my Friday time. So last night I took an hour, which I wouldn't normally. And there was no angst about that because I know that when I leave here and I go have lunch, I won't communicate with you guys. I will have time off my usual work. And I will get to play and pray with God without any sense of it relating to my job. So routine, it helps. What might be yours? You might get creative and think about what else it might include. Dawn says the practice of Thanksgiving is one of the best ways she knows to cease worrying. So if part of your rest is it's actually not even stopping the work, it's stopping my brain, might Thanksgiving be the perfect opportunity to create a threshold moment? What might be your choose your own adventure in that? Or the other side of Sabbath that can help us to be ready, it's not a threshold moment like how we start, it's more how we're ready to start, is, if we go to the next slide, how we prepare before we begin. Because truthfully, if you're going to choose to not cook, then you have to have a solution to know what you're going to eat. If for you, any sense of being, or the garden, I don't know, I just ignore the garden. I spent a lifetime ignoring the garden. If for you, even seeing your work is an issue, I was reading, it's probably not an author here, but one who talks about part of their preparation is they gather up all the books that have been out because they're in a small unit living on their own. They gather up all their books. They don't put them away, but they put them in a pile. So there's not all open and out. So there's a sense of having put aside for that preparation. If it's, because part of Sabbath is with people, is it making plans with friends so that you know that you'll have a meal together and you're ready to go on how that will work and look? Or particularly with family, I think planning ahead on how you'll have that enjoyment together. What might that be? Or even as a couple, what might be the fun and the play you do today? As a single person, I think thinking about if it might be with others, because that would be part of that for me, that would be part of the play. As long as I haven't worn myself out with people in a work setting during the week, because there's a balance. So maybe your choose your own adventure for this week, your invitation into Sabbath experience is what are you going to just think about, not even do. You might know instantly what your one is, but it might be just to reflect on what might be the one thing I add to my list on the, assuming it's Sunday, on my Saturday to make sure I'm prepared to enjoy Sabbath. Or what might be the one thing I do at the beginning of my Sabbath as a ritual that sets me up to enter Sabbath. And as I said, it's okay if you're not ready for an entire day. And in all of that, I'd suggest exactly what Marva Dawn says in her book, Keeping the Sabbath Holy, spelled W-H-O, as in completely. She says, once we have ceased from our work, we might as well not feel guilty about it. Maybe that little reminder. Guilt's going to want to come in and say, but I have, and don't I, and shouldn't I? But we are man-sized and not God-sized. Let's be human-sized. Let's live within the rhythm God has set. And just say to yourself, well, if I'm going to do this, I might as well not feel guilty, so go away, guilt. And set yourself up for success, I guess. I know God will meet us. And I just think it's a beautiful opportunity. And I know there's things to navigate in how you do that when you're in a family unit. My version of rest, Pete's version of rest might be different. Where's the space for together and apart in that? Because it should include both. That with little kids, older kids, it might be how do we do some as family and times as separate? Have conversations. Work through what your ideal is. Let's keep journeying this experience that we might live within the creation rhythm God gave us, that's wired into our being, that we might experience a ceasing rest that is happiness and peacefulness, and that we might worship Him in the process. Our temples of time, not temples of place. I'm excited about that opportunity. I'm continuing to add things. So my hope is that Pete and I will go home and talk about what might be, even though we're both starting at different times, maybe at our lunchtime, what might be that goal. Pete talked about for the preparation one, he just said last night that he chose yesterday. Timesheets need to be completed before Monday morning for the previous week. And he chose intentionally to sit down and do it yesterday. That way he wouldn't do it today. He's starting to just think and process. We decided the week before last week, I think, that we would no longer have lunch out on a Sunday because we didn't feel like we breathed out completely till we came home. So let's get lunch and take it home. And then there's a whole extra hour. Oh, the joy, the gift. Even though I had that hour all along and it was rest anyway. Keep playing with what works for you. Can I pray for us? Lord, it's incredible what you have given us. What a truly remarkable gift that you have. There's this balance you've given. We worship you as we work, and we worship you as we rest. And that rest is more than recovery. It's delight and enjoyment and peace and tranquility. And I know there'll be people here saying, Lord, if I stop, that's not what's going to happen. But Lord, I think there's an invitation in that as well. As we come off essentially what is like being addicted to crack. We are addicted to our busyness. We are addicted to a world that doesn't stop. So Lord, show us how to ease out of that and to find our rest in you. And Lord, as we take those steps, that we would remember there is grace you give us. It's invitation and not about perfection, but about moving forward with you. Thank you, Lord, for your incredible gifts. Amen. I might add, I didn't write it down, but I'll add it now because it came to mind. I'd never heard of this before, but John Mark Comer talks about the J curve. I honestly never heard of it. It makes perfect sense because I've lived it. The idea is once you know something, you make a change. When you start, you get worse. Oh, I should do it your direction. You get worse before you start to improve. Have you ever noticed? You start to learn I learned, what did I learn? I learned to do something one way, and I can't think he talked about learning the guitar by himself, but then he realized he was strumming wrong. And so when learning to strum right, his playing got worse before it then got better and could go further than it had ever gone. Can I encourage you to be aware of that as you head into your week? Because you may find as you start to do some Sabbath things, it gets worse. And you actually observe Sabbath even worse than you did before. You rest even. It's part of the process to setting up. It doesn't feel as smooth to start with, but it sets you off for the off and running. I think the J curve is a valuable grace lesson. Have a wonderful week. I talked about possibly doing a song, but I just feel like this is the right moment to stop in this moment of rest. So, chat with people. Share your journey or don't. Catch up on where they're at. Enjoy a coffee. We're not in any rush. Have a fantastic week. And maybe on Facebook or in other groups, let us know how you're going.